Chapter 2. Hazel. The funeral and wake were crowded with everyone from House Medeus and well-wishers from the magical community, representatives from werewolf packs, fae courts, vampire families, and the other wizarding houses we were allied with. I tried to smile and forced myself to accept handshakes and embraces, but all I wanted to do was scream. What went wrong? I was supposed to meet my parents for a talk, and now I stood in front of their coffins. The police officers who had responded told me it was an accident, a drunk driver, in the middle of the day. She hit their car at an intersection, killing my parents, two of the most powerful wizards in the city, on impact. It was so wrong, but the nightmare had gone on long enough for me to know it was real. I tried to swallow and almost choked. My mouth was too dry. I glanced over my shoulders at the unforgiving black coffins and shuddered. I quickly gazed forward again, meeting the stony expressions of the leaders of the local supernaturals. Sam, the alpha of Pack Whitefrost, scratched his beard, the wrinkles on his forehead deepening as he spoke with Lady Viff, the representative of the Fae Summer Court. My parents had been on good terms with both of them, but they wouldn't meet my gaze. Breathe, I had to remind myself. Breathe. I wanted to scream and demand to know how this could have happened, but I had to stay calm. I, weak magic and all, was all House Medeus had. Though my eyes stung with unshed tears and I wanted to crumple, I couldn't. I had been the heir. Now I was the House Medeus adept, the leader. And not only did I have an old magical house depending on me, but everyone who had been sworn into our family as well. For them, I wouldn't break. At least, not on the outside. I couldn't do anything to stop the pain from tearing my heart from end to end. That was why I looked out at the werewolf alphas, the Fae nobles, the visiting vampires, and all the other powers that be that had come for the funeral, and I knew the truth. They were predators circling me. They were trying to gauge me and see what I'd mean for House Medeus and how that would impact the supernatural community. Based on their expressions, the vampires' curled upper lips, the wolfish grins of the werewolves, the smug smiles of the other wizards, it did not look good. I didn't blame them for their low opinion of me. As the last Medeus, I had to inherit the house. If I died, House Medeus would change names and lose some of its respect, power, and members in the process. It would disband and be reborn, or in reality be rebranded in a new image. If you didn't entirely separate from the old family line, the house would eventually rebel. Yeah, it sounds like a bunch of elitist crap, and for the most part I still think it is. But a magical house throwing a temper tantrum is never good. So, even though I was the weakest wizard in the house, I was now the adept. Do you need a break, adept? Great Aunt Moraine asked. My stomach churned at the title I knew shouldn't have come to me for decades. It's fine. Great Aunt Moraine studied me through bottle cap glasses that made her eyes large and owlish. The house allowed the caterers in, though it was a near thing. All will be ready for the luncheon. Thanks, Great Aunt Moraine. Of course, dear. She looked past me. Judging by the weight in her gaze, she was studying my parents' coffins. They were taken from us too early. My throat squeezed, and I could only manage to stare out at the mourners. But, Great Aunt Moraine continued, you'll be a fine adept. I couldn't help the frown that made my forehead wrinkle as I shifted my stare to her. Had she finally cracked? Great Aunt Moraine was old when I was born, but she'd always been spry and sassy enough to know that an adept who could barely start a campfire wasn't much of an adept at all. She reached out and smoothed my blonde hair away from my face. The blood of the Medeus wizards flows in your veins, Hazel. You'll thrive. And when we get back to the house, you need to eat. The caterer made your father's favorite triple chocolate brownies. You ought to have one, or a dozen. Get some more meat on these bird bones of yours. I tried to smile at her, but the thought that my dad and I would never split another brownie was enough to make pins and needle sensation prickle in my lungs. I will, I lied. Good. Aunt Moraine nodded, then waddled away, her unusual gingham dress a spot of bright blue in the sea of black. I watched her until I noticed Mason drift away from the House Tellier representatives and walk in my direction. Mason was one of the best wizards in House Medeus and was an extremely distant relative. I think his great-great-great-grandmother had been a Medeus, but it was so far back I couldn't remember the specifics, and the connection was so diluted the house didn't consider his blood to be part of my family line. He was in his mid-30s, about 10 years older than me, so I hadn't hung out with him when we were kids, but I'd always admired his talent for magic. He offered me a practiced smile and hugged me, which I was not expecting and was more than a little awkward. His arms were stiff, and I mostly just felt super hot due to his proximity. You do our house credit, Hazel, he said. Thanks. I started to grip the fabric of my black skirt when a quick glance down confirmed the material was already crushed and wrinkled. I'm starting to think this day will never end. It was a terrible accident, Mason said, and a great loss for the wizarding community. He smiled and nodded to a female wizard from House Rothschild, dressed in periwinkle blue. Rothschild was one of our allies, but I doubt the house relationship was what had the other wizards smiling. I was clinically aware Mason was classically good-looking, with a fine smile, broad shoulders, and a clean-cut appearance. But given who my friends were, I was immune to it, and instead pondered how someone could smile at a time like this. The stifling air in the room had me sweating. I had to get away and do something, or I was going to suffocate. Maybe I should start packing the pictures, I muttered as I stared at the easels and tables that displayed printed photos of my parents. I didn't mean for Mason to hear, but he did anyway. He shook his head and folded his arms across his chest. You can't. I blinked. What? You shouldn't, he smoothly corrected. You're our adept now. How would it look to everyone else? Like I'm grieving the loss of my parents? I had to peer up at him, but that didn't mean much. I'm pretty short, so I have to peer up at practically everyone. You're our adept, he repeated. You need to be more aware of what that means and what it means to House Medeus. This was probably why Mason and I didn't talk much. He was a super big fan of having a pecking order in the house and observing tradition, neither of which I loved, though I probably should have because it was likely the only thing that made him support me as an adept. You're overthinking it, I said, doing my best to sound pleasant rather than sour. My parents loaded the dishwasher and took trash out just like everyone else in House Medeus. No one's going to judge us if I help take down some of the pictures so I can get away from these coffins. The last words seemed to hit my gag reflex on the way out of my mouth. Mason pressed his lips together, but before he could dig in and really complain, my salvation arrived. Dear Adept, Felix said with a voice as balmy as a beach sunset, you've been standing for hours. Why don't you sit for a bit? Yeah, Momoko appeared just behind his shoulder and eyed me doubtfully. You look like you might throw up. Together, Felix and Momoko made a striking image. For starters, Felix personified beauty. No, he wasn't handsome, but awesomely beautiful. He outshone a lot of vampires and fey lords and ladies with his bright gold hair, unfathomably blue eyes, slender body, and angelic smile that worked almost as well as a fey persuasion spell. The toddler that sat on his hip and drooled on his crisp black dress shirt didn't dampen his general aura of beauty, but instead seemed to amplify it. Momoko, though also gorgeous, was his exact opposite. She had midnight black hair, eyes so dark they appeared black, and generally looked like she enjoyed lurking around graveyards with the amount of black and gray she wore. Despite her appearance, Momoko was more of an optimist than Felix, and Felix had the personality of a warthog, and spent hours weightlifting every week in a failed attempt to bulk up. But both of them used their appearances to put people off balance, and they wielded their looks with the same finesse they handled their magic. It worked, even on people who knew them, like Mason. Ah, Felix and Momoko. I wondered where you two had run off. Mason nodded at the duo, but shifted ever so slightly away from them. Felix smiled, setting the volume of his sparkling looks on full blast. We were occupying Ivy and some of the other children. He patted the dozing toddler on the back with the ease of practice. Until we saw how terrible Hazel looked, Momoko bluntly said, Come on, Adept, you can leave your post for a bit. Mason rocked back on his heels. Perhaps that is a good idea, he delicately said. Surely I and the other senior members of House Medeus can be stand-ins for the moment. Thanks, Mason. It is my honor, Adept. Momoko didn't wait for any more chit-chat. She circled an arm around my shoulders and towed me away, managing to make it look more like a helpful embrace than bodily corralling me. Even though Momoko was a shade under average height, she was still taller than me. That hadn't been frustrating as a kid. Nope, definitely not. Sorry, Hazel, Momoko said in a voice much softer than the jaded one she'd spoken to Mason with. We should have come sooner. No, I am adept now. I sighed big enough to make my bangs flutter. I needed to be there to receive everyone, and I'll have to go back eventually. I offered the pair a shaky smile, though I'm hoping House Medeus will hide me for a few minutes when we move there for the luncheon. We slipped into the foyer of the funeral parlor and made our escape outside without anyone noticing. Out in the cool spring air, the sweaty heat that clouded around me finally dissipated, and some of the tightness in my chest eased. Felix peered over his shoulder at the closed door. What a bunch of vultures. Momoko hugged me tightly, then joined our childhood friend in scowling at the parlor doors. I hope House Medeus eats their shoes if they dare come over. If it doesn't, we could throw their shoes in the trash and blame it on the house. The wind ruffled Felix's blonde hair. It's not like anyone could prove the house didn't do it. I thought we tried that excuse as kids when some of the brattier wizard kids from House Rothschild visited, I said. I don't think it ended well for us. Now you're the adept, Felix pointed out, though through a horrific circumstance, yes, but that doesn't mean we can't use it to our advantage. I grinned. If we didn't, I'd be disappointed with all three of us. My smile dropped from my lips as I joined them in looking at the funeral parlor. Thanks, guys. I didn't think it was possible for me to laugh today. Felix and Momoko leaned in until their shoulders touched mine. We stayed like that, standing under the stormy gray sky with the wind snapping our hair and clothes, until the doors to the funeral parlor opened. There you three are. Mr. Clark, one of the senior wizards in House Medeus, and Felix's dad, as testified by his soulful blue eyes Felix had inherited, shoved his pockets in the pockets of his black trousers and joined us outside. Shoved his hands in the pockets of his black trousers and joined us outside. He paused just short of us and bowed his head. Adept? The pins were back in my throat. Please don't, Mr. Clark. He shook his head. It's Ed now. I almost shuddered at the thought. You've been Mr. Clark my whole life. And now you're the adept, he said. You'll be calling all of us in House Medeus by our first names. I scrubbed my face with my palms. I don't think I can do this. You can, Mr. Clark said firmly. House Medeus believes in you. He held out his arms to take Ivy, his granddaughter, and the daughter of Felix's older brother, Franco, who was also a member of House Medeus. But you don't have to do it all at once. This came as a shock and a tragedy to everyone. We can take it slow with you as you adjust, Hazel. His voice was so understanding I couldn't look at him. Instead, I stared at Ivy, who blearily stirred as she realized she'd been handed off. When she saw me, she smiled and tugged at her necklace, which I suspect was self-made as it mostly consisted of macaroni and colored yarn. Hazel, she said in her cute voice. I cracked a smile. Hello, Ivy. Did you have a nice nap? Ivy yanked on her necklace, making the metal loop someone, her mother I suspected, had threaded through the necklace to weigh it down, smack her in the face. This is for you. I made the necessary oohing noises. It's very pretty. Mama said you're sad. I felt my smile splinter. Just a bit. Mr. Clark stabilized her when she squirmed in his arms, trying to get the necklace off, but the little girl stopped trying when another wizard left the funeral parlor. Mr. Bear! Ivy called out in delight. The wizard, a large man who was hulking enough to rival a werewolf, smiled. Hello there, Ivy girl. Hello, Mr. Barry, Felix said in his very rare but true tone of respect, probably because the man had all the muscle and bulk Felix wanted. Mr. Barry grinned at Felix, but like Mr. Clark, he bowed his head to me. Adept? He folded his meaty arms across his chest and squinted down at me. I can go back inside. I didn't bother to attempt to smile, but I inhaled deeply and rolled my shoulders back, which probably did more to convince them anyway. We can wait, Mr. Barry said. It's expected. Mr. Barry snorted. What's expected can take a swan dive off a steep cliff. This isn't a sprint, Adept. It's a lifestyle. You can take your time and settle in. No one's expecting you to be perfect the week your parents pass away. Mr. Clark rested his hand on my shoulder. Roy is right. You're the last in the Medeus line. House Medeus needs you, which means it's important that you survive and don't burn yourself out. Mr. Barry nodded. The house comes first, he said, repeating the ancient adage I'd heard probably the day I was born. Which means you're now our top priority. If some folks are displeased or House Medeus loses a bit of its austerity, it doesn't matter. You are far more important. He meant to be encouraging, or supportive, or something. But those words made my stomach heave. It felt so wrong. How could you prioritize like that? Sure, it was how wizarding houses were supposed to operate, but I'd never seen it so brutally displayed for me. Everyone in House Medeus would prioritize my well-being over everything. Right, well, I'm fine, so in we go. I trundled into motion. If I stood there and listened anymore, there was a very good chance I was going to throw up. Are there any more representatives from our close allies I should greet? I chattered to fill the silence. Not any that matter, Felix sniffed. Well said, Mr. Barry growled. I slipped back inside the funeral parlor before the others could join me. My eyes automatically slid to the viewing room where my parents' coffins were, but I jerked my gaze away and peered around the foyer. Mason was standing with someone at the viewing room door. Perfect. I could ask him if I'd missed anything. I slipped through the straggling mourners. With my height, I often got mistaken as a high school student. Pretty often. So no one paid any attention as I padded around them, bits and pieces of their conversation reaching me. Drake struck down a law that would have allotted space for another wolf pack in northern Minnesota. You're surprised? No, just disgusted he can control our regional committee of magic. Vampires rule the Midwest, my friend. The rest of the exchange fell out of my hearing range as I edged around the two tall women, werewolves, judging by the gold gleams in their eyes. Ugh, politics. Politics I'd soon have to worry about as the House Medeus adept. I briefly shut my eyes. Life had become a waking nightmare. Losing my parents had torn a hole in my heart, and being responsible for House Medeus was a different level of horror. But the politics, the leading, how was I going to manage it? Especially once everyone in my house started going back to work. Adept was considered a full-time position, so I'd spend my days waffling through my new workload. But besides Great Aunt Moraine, everyone else had jobs or school. The only reason I still didn't have college was because I had luckily finished my business degree a semester early in the winter. A part of me felt angry with my parents that they hadn't better prepared me, but it wasn't their fault. Heirs received the first part of their training when they turned 20, and then received more responsibilities and training after they reached 25. I hadn't ever questioned that policy before, until now. Another breath and a correction to my posture, and I made myself cross the remaining distance to Mason. I was surprised to find he was talking to a wizard from House Tellier. Medeus and Tellier weren't enemies, but we weren't friendly either, given Gideon's tendency to bother me, and Momoko's methods of revenge, which usually involve lightning. The two spoke in lowered tones, though Mason smiled when he saw me. Ah, Adept, we were just talking about you. Yes, the House Tellier wizard smiled, but it seemed flat and insincere. When do you think we might observe the grand occasion of your ascension? Ascension was the old and showy ceremony that basically was the handoff of the house to the heir-turned-adept. There were a few speeches to give, and I'd get officially sworn in as an adept, but the most important part was that I would make my vows to the house and bind it to me. The house would then physically change in accordance with my magic and the kind of person I was. It would still keep that Victorian house crossed with a chateau feel to it, but it might grow bigger, unlikely, or smaller, most probable, grow some new gardens, or, as had been my dearest childhood dream, sprout a pool. I don't imagine for a couple weeks, I said. There's still a lot to settle. My gaze again strayed to the viewing room before I yanked it back. Mason's smile turned overpoweringly sympathetic, like too much sugar in your coffee. Of course, Adept, you need time to mourn your parents. And to notify the Wizard Council, gather the records, and find the House Medeus signet ring, the House Tellier wizard added, unless you already have it. No, I clasped my hands behind my back so I wouldn't be tempted to make any rude gestures I would regret later. Given the tragedy, having my parents' will read hasn't been a priority. The two wizards exchanged an indiscernible look. Of course, Adept, Mason said smoothly. If I can be of any service in the meantime, just ask. I'd been eyeing the Tellier wizard, but when Mason spoke, I shifted my attention to him. He said that already. Is he just putting on a show for House Tellier? It seemed my future in politics was grimmer than I thought. Thanks. Mason bowed slightly. It is my honor. The house comes first, after all. 3 weeks passed, and the unbearable pain left by my parents' death settled into a dull ache. Laughing came more easily, but sleeping was rough. I spent hours every night walking House Medeus. The magical house was both comforting and a stark reminder that I was less than an adept should have been, less trained and less skilled. I'm going to have to come up with a method to supplement my magical power, I reluctantly concluded, or House Medeus will crumble even though I'm the rightful heir. I mean, kicking kneecaps and being as squirmy as an eel works for facing off with people like Gideon, but that's not going to help with politics. But what would work? Stronger allies would be ideal, but who would want to befriend us that didn't want to when my parents were alive? I scratched under the elastic waistband of my owl fleece pajama pants. Though it was late spring, nights were still cool, and House Medeus was always a bit drafty. A good thing, given wizards tended to run hot most of the time. The house grumbled under my feet as it turned on a dusty chandelier for me while I ambled down one of the long hallways. Maybe I should give the senior Medeus wizards more power. It would be unusual, but not entirely unheard of or unexpected. I popped into the bathroom and pulled on the knob for cold water, filling my ceramic mug. I turned off the tap before I took a sip, making a face at the steaming hot water. It seems like the ice-cold shower I had earlier was not because Felix used too much water on the gardens, but because the house is upset. How wonderful. I set the mug down on the counter and leaned against a wall covered in blue damask wallpaper. I'm sorry, I told the creaking building. I know you're growing weaker because I haven't had my ascension yet. I'll get it sorted out soon. The water pipes groaned ominously, and the black and white tile under my feet rumbled. I'll call my parents' lawyer in the morning, I hastily added. We still haven't had their will read or the deed transferred, and the signet is stored with all of that, I think. My answer must have satisfied the house because it finally shut up. I considered trying for cold water again, but decided not to push it. If I had ascended and become the proper adept, I could command the house to give me whatever kind of water I wanted. Supposedly, I'd be able to sort of communicate with it rather than just guess at the source of its foul moods. But until then, it seemed like I'd be getting hot drinking water and cold showers. I exited the bathroom and shuffled back up the hallway. I was trying to decide between heading to the library to find a book to read or going to the kitchen for a snack when the door creaked. Curious, I swung around and jumped when I found Mason standing right behind me. Geez, Mason, you scared me. I took a few steps backwards, but Mason grabbed me by the shoulders, stopping me. His face was shadowed in the flickering hallway light. We need to talk. Sure, I agreed as I adjusted my fleece pajama pants again. Sometime tomorrow, or... I frowned when I studied Mason and saw he wasn't dressed in sleepwear like me, but a crisp, pristine suit with the House Medeus coat of arms, which had a rampant leopard and a white unicorn rearing over a shield over its breast pocket. Now, Mason said. The wind shrieked as it whistled through the trees just outside, and I thought I felt House Medeus quiver. Fine, I said. What about? I tried to ease out of his grasp, and he dug his fingers into my shoulders. You're aware we're related? Mason said. Distantly, yeah. Aren't you like my third cousin 3 times removed or something? Mason relaxed slightly. Yes, I have Medeus blood in my veins, though it's so little wizard law won't count it. But what I lack in pedigree, I make up for in power. Why is there something unnerving about the way he's talking? I tried to lean so he would have to step more into the light. I might be able to read something in his expression, but he pulled me back. I licked my lips. You're obviously known for being strong in magic. It's why you're the youngest senior wizard in House Medeus. He was weirding me out enough that I tried to nonchalantly feel the pocket in my pajama pants for my cell phone, but I must have left it in my room. Precisely, whereas you have the blue blood of the Medeus but are practically a dud, Mason said. I sighed and fluffed my hair with a hand. Is this about me not having much magic? Because I already know we'll have to come up with another alternative to keep our power consolidated, but that's something I should be discussing with all the senior wizards. I've already come up with the alternative we will take. I narrowed my eyes at him. Will we? We should get married. My forehead puckered and my mouth dropped open. What did you say? It's the most logical move, Mason said. You can't run House Medeus alone. Mason. My voice was hot with frustration. I'll admit to being a weak adept, but it is an insane jump to go from there to we should get married. You're unable to protect yourself or House Medeus, Mason said. Yeah, I agreed. I have no delusions about my power, but there are about 1,000 different plans we can enact that don't involve the two of us getting hitched. You don't even like me. The house comes before all. That's nice, but I draw the line at an arranged marriage. My voice was growing louder with my disbelief. Adept, is everything okay? Felix poked his head out of his bedroom, his gold hair shining in the dull light as he peered suspiciously at Mason. I gritted my teeth but forcibly smiled. Yes, I was just having a discussion with Mason. I yanked myself from Mason's grasp and he let his arms drop. Mason offered me a smile. Won't you even consider it? Was this why he'd been so friendly the past few weeks? Not because of my parents' death, but because he was hoping to sway me? No, I said, I won't consider it because it's not necessary. Felix frowned and fully emerged from his room, pausing to roughly kick a few other bedroom doors. It's the fastest way, Mason said, and speed is vital in this case. I sourly pressed my lips together to keep from shrieking. Not important enough to make you propose in the middle of the night. Felix made a choking noise as Momoko, Great Aunt Moraine, and Franco, Felix's older brother, emerged from their quarters. Momoko yawned and stretched her arms above her head. What's going on? Mason has apparently lost it, Felix said. Maybe if he was sleeping right now, this wouldn't be a problem. Great Aunt Moraine struggled to put on her thick blue-framed glasses. Her hair was in curlers, and she looked fierce as she tied on her purple bathrobe. Mason glanced back at our family, and I sighed. It wasn't my intention to publicly embarrass him. Who knows, maybe that was why he approached me at night? I'm 22, Mason, I reminded him. I've been the adept for 3 weeks. Figuring out the new power balance doesn't have to be an instant thing. Mason stared up at the ceiling. It would have been easier this way. I furrowed my eyebrows. What are you talking about? An explosion rocked the house, making the lights shake and the walls groan.